Bonjour tout le monde, welcome back to We in France, where we talk about everyday French life and beyond. I'm Diane, an American who's been living out in the Loire Valley since about 2012. I also blog over at weinfrance.com, and today's topic is a fun one. It's all about culture shock. So to start, let's keep it simple and define what culture shock is. The Oxford Languages describes it as, quote, the feeling of disorientation experienced by someone when they are suddenly subjected to unfamiliar culture, way of life, or a set of attitudes, unquote. And every country around the world has its own way of doing things, and France is no exception on that front. If you've lived in one country most of your life and then have the opportunity to visit or move somewhere else, it's only normal that you'll notice the differences between the two places and maybe even be shocked by them. And I find personally cultural differences really fun and interesting. I talk about them a lot here on my channel and on the blog, and after all, it's a learning experience, right? So these cultural norms in France that I'm going to be speaking about might make you fall in love with France. I have, laugh, I've done that too, and also cry or just throw your hands up in exasperation or leave you scratching your head a bit confused. So yeah, it's all part of the process as you discover a new culture and adapt. And keep in mind that many of the things I mention here might actually apply to other areas in Europe, not just France. All right, and just a note before I get into it, these are not all deep, hard-hitting, shocking things, pearl clutchers that, have shook me to my core or anything so serious that they really bother me. Not at all. They're just culture shock moments. You acknowledge them, you move on. Maybe they're culture surprises or just little differences. All right, so let's get into the 10 biggest culture shocks I discovered after moving to France, although I could probably have made a list here about 50 things, and this would have been a really long video. Okay, number 1, pharmacy culture. According to Class Consulting, there are about 21,000 pharmacies in France, and something to note is that French pharmacies are all privately owned. And there might be a few exceptions, but what I mean here, you will not find big name chains like Walgreens, Duane Reade, CVS, or Boots like you'd find in the US or the UK. And the French love their pharmacies, you'll notice that right away, and I've come to love them as well. You'll notice a pharmacy because there's flashing green signs that light up above the pharmacy, and even the smallest towns in France have a pharmacy or two to call their own. And the shocking part for me isn't the prevalence of pharmacies, it's kind of when you have to describe every last disgusting detail of what ails you in order to get your medicine. So forget about discreetly grabbing, your Imodium diarrhea medicine and paying at the self-checkout at the grocery store, because in France, medicines are only available at the pharmacy. So that means you can't just pop into your supermarket to get Advil or anything else that you might normally find at the grocery store at home. In France, you need to go speak to your pharmacist or pharmacy employee. Another thing you'll notice in French pharmacies is that they don't sell magazines, gum, snacks, or any of the other things you'd find, at CVS in the US. Pharmacies in France are for medication, for over-the-counter and prescription items, and also parapharmacy products. So we're talking about things like cosmetics, skincare, and other non-prescription items. Something that I love is that in France, the pharmacist is quite hands-on, and everyone working at the pharmacy has pharmacology training. So even, the minimum would be préparateur en pharmacie, and that's someone who's able to do more than just ring you up or check your records in the computer. So that's just to say there are no cashiers who just work the register in a French pharmacy. Everyone has a basic training. So pharmacists counsel, advise, and listen to your ailments almost like a doctor would. So if you have a sprain, a burn, a bug bite, or any other common ailment, you could be treated for these minor things by your local pharmacist. And for non-emergencies that maybe don't require a doctor's visit, it's totally fine to go see your pharmacist. He or she is there and ready to help. And just to clarify, I'm not saying that pharmacists don't do this in the US. I'm sure they can and do, but I found it to be on a much different level in France. It's much more common, I would say, to have a full-blown conversation with your French pharmacist beyond just picking up a quick prescription. And I find this really endearing just about the whole pharmacy system. The pharmacy is also just one of my favorite parts about everyday life in France. So step into one, if you come for a visit just to have a look, and you never know what fun things you might find. And P.S. I have a few pharmacy related videos on my channel. I did a whole live walk in one and some favorite pharmacy products and all that. So please check that out if it's of interest. I'll try to link it up above. All right. Let's get into number 2. The French use checks, as in, yes, paper checks from a checkbook that you write out to pay for things. And no, it's not 1995, it's modern day France, and your eyes are not deceiving you. These are checkbooks, and the check you see from that lady whipping it out in front of you at the grocery store is real life. I see it all the time, and you know who they are because it's the person holding up the line. And strangely enough, or maybe not, everyone patiently waits and they're just used to it while people write out checks. You could use them at the doctor, the pharmacy. It's a totally normal and quite common method of payment. I have to say maybe for the older generation, but you do see it. And I feel like you see it a lot more frequently in France than the USA. And as you probably know, a benefit to paying by check is that the money won't leave your account for a couple of days, once the person cashes it and the bank processes the transaction. So if you know your paycheck's coming, but you don't have the money in your account now to pay by a debit card, write a check, save yourself a little time. Writing a check's a good way to keep the charge from hitting your account right away, like it would with a debit card. Number 3, let's stick with money for a second. The French do not really use credit cards. And this is something I became aware of after moving to France and seeing how the French do banking. First, the French don't generally use credit cards and have personal lines of credit, via a charge card or a credit card, at least not to the extent that we use them in the USA or Canada and the UK. And they're definitely not used for day-to-day purchases. I will say that they're more commonly used by business owners, so credit cards do exist, but they're not commonplace for the everyday person. So credit cards with points or cash back really aren't mainstream. The French favor debit cards, which are called carte bleue, and are the norm. So for anyone unfamiliar, credit cards allow the purchaser to buy now and pay later via a line of credit that's extended to them each month. So unlike a debit card where you pay for something and the money leaves your account immediately, a credit card company hits you with a bill each month that you can then pay in full or in installments until the balance is paid off if you don't have everything in one fell swoop. So in nations like the US, the UK, Canada, Australia, credit cards are a very common way to pay for things. There are airline credit cards, cash back, as I said. But in France, debit cards, as I mentioned, are widely used where the money comes out of your account immediately. And yes, there's an option on some cards. It's getting more popular to have the total amount you've spent during the entire month debited at the end of the month in one big transaction, not at the point of sale in real time. And that's called a débit différé. But it's not something everyone has or uses, and it still doesn't function like a debit card does. So yeah, because of this, the French don't carry a ton of personal debt. It's not a credit society. Stores do offer credits individually for larger purchases, so an option to pay in installments, but it's usually handled by the specific merchant. So aside from that, if your money's not in your account, you don't make the purchase. Another thing to note is that in France, people don't have a credit score like we have in the US that's used to assess, your ability to pay when trying to get a loan, a mortgage, rent an apartment. And yes, of course, certain French people are in debt, do go bankrupt, but it's on a much smaller scale because credit cards are not commonplace. All right, next 4, interesting cuts of meat in the grocery store. And this one, when I first moved to France, really did shock me, and sometimes does, to see the entire rabbit with its eyes in the grocery store staring back at you, or a big cow tongue. And I'm not a vegetarian. Logically, I know meat comes from an animal, but just the way that it was presented to the consumer in France was very different. And the meat types that are common in France were new to me. So as I said, cow tongue, tripe, different types of organ meat and all of that. So I'll put a few pictures up on the screen so you know what I'm talking about, but this is a warning. If you're sensitive to pictures of raw meat, look away now. And the French, they do eat chicken, pork, beef, which are all common in the US as well. But, do keep your eyes peeled for different cuts of meat that maybe are something you aren't used to seeing at the grocery store, and maybe you'll really like them. All right, for anyone who looked away, you can look back again. There's no more meat pictures on the screen. All right, let's head on to number 5. I love this one. There are so many bakeries and also hair salons. But according to NPR, France has more than 30,000 independent bakeries across the nation, and the French consume around 10 billion with a B baguettes per year. And the French love their bread. What can I say? It's not just a stereotype to see a French person walking home with a baguette under their arm. That's real life. It's totally true. You see it quite commonly, and maybe I've even turned into one of those people. So yeah, it's funny how things change. But yeah, you could pick up a whole baguette, a bunch of other types of bread, half a baguette, pastries, desserts, whatever you want, grab it. It's normal. The bakeries are there for you. And something else I noticed, there are a ton of hair salons in France. Whereas in the USA, maybe there were more nail salons. And of course, hair salons exist in the US, of course, but it just seems like there are so many more per capita in France. The French love getting their hair done. All right, next, 6 is la bise. The French do cheek kisses to say hi, and maybe less now because the pandemic, it's no longer a thing for the time being. But keep in mind the French do not, I repeat, do not hug to say hi. I personally learned this right away, and although I knew that the French didn't hug, sometimes you do things out of habit. And this was the case for me when I first met my now father-in-law. I knew that I wasn't supposed to hug him, but that the French did cheek kisses, but automatically, I just went in for the hug, overcome by emotion, just happy in the moment. And my father-in-law just stood there, like stiff as a board with his arms at his side, like unsure what to do. And, I learned right away to snap out of that habit. You cheek kiss friends and family generally when you arrive and leave. And even some coworkers greet each other each morning upon arriving at work. So it just depends on the employer. And the French are very much into greetings. So, an American, hey, when you arrive at a party late, it just won't cut it. And I have a whole video about my thoughts on la bise on my channel. I'm much more comfortable hugging, but hey, you adapt and I do the bise. I just don't love it. Okay, number 7, late dinner time. In France, dinner is normally eaten later than at least what I did in the US. So in the US growing up, I'd probably eat dinner as a family between 6 and 7 each evening because as kids, we had activities after dinner. So it made sense to eat early. And I would also, as I grew up, I would wake up for work at 5 a.m. So by 6 at night, I was hungry again. And living in New York City, generally we ate dinner later depending on what I had on my plate for the day with work or if I went to the gym. So New Yorkers eat, I would say a little later in general, but many Americans are perfectly fine with sitting down to eat at 6 p.m., especially if you have young kids. So of course, not all Americans eat this early and not all the time, just like all French people don't eat dinner late every single day. But in the US in the winter, a family with kids who might have activities outside the home will sit down to eat at 6 p.m. But in France, I would say dinner is really 7:30 p.m. at the earliest, and most restaurants in France aren't even open for dinner before 7:30, 8 o'clock. So plan accordingly. And this is especially true outside of big cities. And if you have a French dinner party and you want to invite your French neighbors and friends, do not tell them dinner's at 6. They will look at you like you're nuts and that you're running a nursing home where they eat on the early side. But, for me personally, these days we eat dinner around 8 p.m. and, my stomach's adapted. All right, number 8, smoking. It may surprise you to see that more people smoke in France, especially young kids, like early teenagers, 13, 14, 15. Than what you're used to back home. And yeah, it depends where you're from, but generally speaking, men and women of all ages in France seem to smoke a lot more than what I perceived it to be in the US. Tabac, where you buy cigarettes, always have a ton of customers buying cigarettes, and I just feel like it's more accepted as part of French culture, regardless of one's education or income level. It's not just lower educated people in rural areas. It's people across demographics. And I feel like in the USA, in a lot of circles, people would find smoking anything but cool and acceptable. And even the CDC has some stats. So cigarette smoking is the leading cause of preventable disease and death in the USA, accounting for more than 480,000 deaths every year, or about 1 in 5. So as of 2018, nearly 14 Of every 100 US adults aged 18 or older, so 13.7%, currently smoke cigarettes. And if we turn and look at France, smoking rates have increased from 29.9% in 2005 to 34.1% in 2014. All right, number 9, veterinarian care is amazing. My dog is my child and her health is just as important as my own. So it warms my heart to include this on the list to say that I have been shocked how wonderful vet care has been in France and how much cheaper it is. And I find the vets to be really personable and hands-on. And, it's less of a money-making business in France with outrageous prices. And I just have found it to be more about your specific animal and their care. So, of course, there are great veterinarians in the USA and vet practices. But in my experience overall, I feel like France is just a level up. So even in smaller cities, there's a 24-hour emergency system. Specialists are easy to come by. And my dog has always been treated with nothing but respect and love. And she's seen vets all over when she's run into trouble when we're away, got pricked in the eye by a thorn bush, and experiences have been great. So if you plan on moving to France or even visiting with your pet, you can breathe easy just knowing that your pet will be taken care of here. And I really don't say that lightly. Okay, number 10, public urination. And this is one that gets people really fired up. And I have to admit, seeing grown men pee in public really did catch me by surprise. Now it's normal, but I noticed this would frequently happen, when I was any time of day, in the park, in the town, wherever, and it wasn't just a weird fluke, I'd see it several times per week. And I don't know, is it an issue of a small bladder? Are the men too lazy to find a restroom? A thing of convenience? I don't know. It certainly is a thing, and it's not just something drunk or homeless people do. And of course, I acknowledge that, some men have medical issues where it might be, an emergency and urgent need, but are all the men who are peeing in public, are they, under the care of a doctor for a medical condition? No. Often when I see it, a free public restroom is about a 2-minute walk away, but I guess it's just easier to relieve yourself on the side of a building or on the bushes. And it's always with your back in full view of cars going by or other people passing on foot. So you're not really concealing yourself, French dudes. Technically, public urination carries a 68 euro fine in Paris. I don't think it's really enforced because it's a common sight and pretty accepted that men pee in public. Check out the Nat Geo link below. It's an article from a couple of years ago all about Paris's plan to, quote, cover up that pee smell, unquote. And in my area, several hours west of Paris, I really do see a small handful of men urinating publicly every week in the park, and some people in my neighborhood, they have properties, very popular with the peers, like a house that kind of its back wall will back up to an alleyway. And they've resorted to putting up signage, as shown here, I'll put it up on the screen, to remind people that the side of their house is not a urinal, or in French, it's called a pissoir. So yeah, if you're a French guy watching this, tell me in the comments, do you regularly urinate in public or, never or only when you really have to go? Like, do you duck behind a trash bin when you're out in town with your family? Is it an okay thing to do or not? I don't know. Okay, I'm gonna end this here before it gets too long, but again, if you learned anything and you like this type of content about culture shock, please let me know in the comments and give me a thumbs up. Also, a few of you were so sweet and asked me if I had a physical mailing address you wanted to send a Christmas card. I would love that. The holidays are a little different this year with the pandemic, so thank you, and you could find that address down below in the description. And also, I do have a line of merch. Tote bags, t-shirts, mugs, with my favorite design being this one. It's a perfect sentiment for 2020, I think. Just about wraps up the year. So check that out for your holiday shopping or just because. And I really appreciate you being here and taking the time to watch and talk to me here on We in France. Thank you so much, and I'll see you back here soon. Salut!